The noise in the lecture hall was unlike anything Jake had ever heard before. Insectoid students clicked so rapidly it sounded like machine gun fire. The ethereals produced a high-pitched whine that made the air around their containment fields vibrate. Lupari students howled and barked in patterns that sounded almost like laughter, but not the kind that meant something was funny. Professor Kelthera raised all four of her arms, and the universal translator system amplified her voice above the chaos. "Silence, please. Everyone settle down." The noise gradually died away, though Jake could still hear quiet chittering and muttering from various corners of the hall. The professor's crystalline blue skin had shifted to a pale yellow color, which Jake had learned meant confusion or deep thought among her people. She looked directly at him with all four of her large, dark eyes. "Mr. Morrison," she said carefully, "I believe there may be some misunderstanding. Perhaps you are thinking of species that were nearly extinct but managed to recover naturally, or species that were extinct in one region but survived in another." Jake shook his head and pulled out his data pad. "No, Professor. I mean species that were completely extinct, with no living members anywhere that humans brought back to life." He scrolled through some files he had downloaded for a previous assignment, like the California condor. It went extinct in the wild in 1987, and we were down to just 27 birds total, all in captivity. Everyone thought they were done for. He found the file he was looking for and held up his datapad so the class could see the image of a large bird with black feathers and a bald red head. Now there are over 500 of them flying free in California, Arizona, and Utah. We bred them back from those last 27 birds. A Korath student in the middle of the hall growled something that the translator rendered as captive. "Breeding programs are not resurrection from extinction. Every intelligent species attempts to save endangered creatures through breeding." "You're right," Jake said, nodding. "Captive breeding isn't really bringing something back from extinction. But we've also done actual resurrection of species that were completely dead." He scrolled through more files. Like the Pyrenean ibex. The last one died in the year 2000, killed by a falling tree. But we had taken tissue samples from her before she died. Jake stood up so more people could see him as he talked. In 2003, scientists used DNA from those tissue samples to clone her. They implanted the cloned embryo into a domestic goat, and she gave birth to a Pyrenean ibex. The clone only lived for 10 minutes because of lung problems. But for those 10 minutes, a completely extinct species was alive again. The hall had gone completely silent now. Even the ethereals had stopped their constant humming, which Jake had never seen happen before during a class. Professor Kelthera's skin color shifted from yellow to a deep orange. "Mr. Morrison, are you telling us that humans have the technology to recreate life from preserved genetic material of extinct species?" "Well, yeah," Jake said, sitting back down. "We call it de-extinction or resurrection biology. We've done it with several species now. There are companies working on bringing back woolly mammoths using DNA from frozen specimens found in Siberian ice. They want to use elephant eggs and elephant surrogate mothers to birth baby mammoths." Lisa Chen, sitting next to him, spoke up for the first time. "The passenger pigeon project is probably the most advanced right now," she said. "Passenger pigeons went extinct in 1914. But we've been able to sequence their complete genome from museum specimens. Scientists are editing the DNA of band-tailed pigeons to match passenger pigeon genetics." A Vorthon student in the front row turned around to stare at them, her crystalline features reflecting the light and patterns that indicated extreme surprise. Her voice came through the translator with a musical quality. "You speak of this as if it is routine. How many species has your race resurrected?" Jake scratched his head, thinking. "I'm not really sure of the exact number. Lisa would know better than me since she wrote her thesis on this stuff." He looked at Lisa. "Didn't you say we've successfully brought back over 30 species so far?" Lisa nodded. "As of last year, there were 37 confirmed successful de-extinctions, with genetic material preserved for about 2,000 more extinct species. And that's just the ones we know about. There are probably private labs and government programs working on projects they haven't announced yet." The lecture hall erupted again, but this time the sounds were different. Instead of disbelief, Jake heard what sounded like fear mixed with amazement. An ethereal near the front produced a sound so high-pitched that it made Jake's teeth ache. Professor Kelthera held up her hands again for silence, but it took much longer this time for the hall to quiet down. When it finally did, she looked directly at Jake with an expression he couldn't read. "Mr. Morrison." "Mrs. Chen," she said slowly. "In all of galactic history, no species has ever successfully restored a completely extinct creature to life. The technology exists in theory, but the practical challenges have always been considered impossible to overcome." "Really?" Jake said, genuinely surprised. "But it's not that hard once you figure out the DNA sequencing and cloning techniques. I mean, it's not easy, but it's not impossible either. We've been cloning sheep and cows and horses for decades now." A Lupari student raised her paw. "On my world, we have genetic samples from 1/200 species lost during our industrial period." "Are you saying these could be brought back to life?" "Probably," Lisa said. "As long as the DNA isn't too damaged and you have a closely related species to use as an egg donor and surrogate mother. The older the samples are, the harder it gets, but we've managed to get usable DNA from specimens that are thousands of years old." An insectoid student clicked rapidly, and the translator rendered her speech. "What about species that have been extinct for millions of years?" Jake grinned. "That's where it gets really exciting. We've found dinosaur DNA in amber deposits, preserved in tree resin for 65 million years. The DNA is pretty fragmented, but some scientists think they can fill in the gaps using bird DNA, since birds are descended from dinosaurs." The clicking from the insectoid student became so rapid that the translator couldn't keep up with it. Other students began talking excitedly to each other in their own languages, creating a babble of different sounds that the translation system struggled to handle. Professor Kelthera's skin had now shifted to a deep purple color that Jake had never seen before. She stood perfectly still for several long moments, staring at nothing as if she was processing information that didn't fit into her understanding of the universe. "Class dismissed," she said suddenly. "We will continue this discussion tomorrow. Mr. Morris and Miss Chen, please remain after class. I need to ask you some additional questions about these resurrection technologies." Students began filing out of the hall, but Jake noticed they were all talking excitedly and many of them kept looking back at him and Lisa. The Korath students were growling to each other in low tones that sounded urgent. The ethereals were producing harmonics that Jake had learned indicated confusion or distress. As the hall emptied, Professor Kelthera walked over to where Jake and Lisa were sitting. Her forearms moved independently as she pulled up new displays on her portable hologram generator. "I need you to understand something," she said, her voice much quieter now. "What you have described is not just scientifically remarkable. It challenges one of the fundamental assumptions that galactic civilization is built upon." She gestured to the holographic display, which now showed a timeline of galactic history. For 10,000 years, every species that has joined galactic society has shared the same experience. They all lost species during their technological development, and they all learned to accept that these losses were permanent. The display showed dozens of different worlds and the extinct creatures that had once lived on them. This shared experience of permanent loss is what taught our species wisdom, restraint, and the value of preservation. It's why we cooperate instead of compete. It's the foundation of our ethics and our philosophy. Professor Kelthera looked directly at Jake. But humans, it seems, decided that extinction was optional. Jake stared at Professor Kelthera, not understanding why she looked so worried. "Well, yeah, I guess extinction is optional if you have the right technology. Why would anyone want to keep something extinct if they could bring it back?" The professor's purple skin shifted to an even deeper shade, almost black now. She began pacing back and forth in front of the empty lecture hall, her forearms gesturing as she spoke. "Mr. Morrison, you must understand what you are saying. Every species in the galaxy builds monuments to their extinct creatures. We write poetry about them. We base entire philosophical movements on the lessons learned from permanent loss." She stopped pacing and looked directly at him. "The ethereal's greatest works of art are about the beauty of endings. The Korath consider their extinct species to be honored ancestors who achieved transcendence through death." Lisa shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "But if you can bring them back, why wouldn't you? I mean, wouldn't the Korath want to meet their honored ancestors again?" Professor Kelthara made a sound that the translator couldn't render into any known language. "Ms. Chen, you are missing the point. The loss itself is what made them ancestors. The permanence of their absence is what gives meaning to their memory." Jake scratched his head. "I'm sorry, Professor, but that doesn't make any sense to me. If my great-grandmother could come back to life, I'd want to meet her. She died when my dad was little, But we've got her DNA stored in a genetic bank. My cousin Danny is working for a company that thinks they can clone people with their original memories intact. The professor stopped moving entirely. Her skin went completely white, which Jake had never seen before. Mr. Morrison, are you telling me that humans are working on resurrecting individual people who have died? Sure, Jake said. I mean, we're not there yet, but we're working on it. There are companies trying to figure out how to upload consciousness to computers. Others are working on nanobots that could repair brain damage and restart stopped hearts. Some people even freeze themselves when they die, hoping we'll figure out how to fix whatever killed them. Professor Kelthera sat down heavily in the nearest chair. Individual resurrection, consciousness transfer, reversal of death itself. She looked up at Jake and Lisa. Do humans view death as permanent? Jake and Lisa looked at each other. Not really, Lisa said. I mean, we don't like it, and we're always trying to figure out ways around it. My grandfather has been in a coma for 3 years, but the doctors say his brain is still active. There are experimental treatments that might wake him up. My aunt died of cancer last year, Jake added, but they managed to cure the same type of cancer in mice using gene therapy. If we'd had another year or two to perfect the treatment, she'd probably still be alive. That's why a lot of people are getting frozen now when they die from diseases we can't cure yet. Professor Kelthera's forehands moved to cover her face. You view death itself as a temporary setback. Well, Jake said thoughtfully, maybe not temporary, but definitely not permanent. It's just a really hard problem that we haven't completely solved yet, but we're working on it. The professor stood up abruptly and began pacing again, this time much faster. I need to contact the Department of Galactic Philosophy immediately, and the Council of Species, and probably the Emergency Session Committee. She pulled out a communication device that looked like a crystal prism. This conversation needs to be reported to the highest levels of galactic government. Are we in trouble? Lisa asked nervously. Trouble? Professor Kelthera laughed, but it didn't sound like a happy laugh. Ms. Chen, you may have just caused the biggest philosophical crisis in galactic history. She spoke into her communication device in her own language, a series of musical tones that rose and fell in complex patterns. After a few moments, she switched back to Galactic Standard. The Chancellor of Xenobiology wants to speak with both of you immediately. So does the Dean of Universal Philosophy. And I just received a priority message from someone at the Galactic Council offices. Jake felt his stomach drop. Professor, I really didn't mean to cause any problems. I was just answering your question about extinct species. I know, Mr. Morrison. That's what makes this so significant. She gathered up her teaching materials with all 4 arms working at once. You gave an honest answer to a simple question, and that honest answer has revealed something about humanity that we never understood. As they walked out of the lecture hall, Jake noticed that word had already spread around the university. Groups of alien students stopped their conversations to stare at him as he passed. Some of them followed at a distance as if they wanted to hear what he might say next. Professor, Lisa said, what exactly is going to happen now? I honestly don't know, Professor Kelthera replied. In my 4 centuries of life, I have never encountered a species that views extinction and death as optional. The implications are staggering. They entered the administration building where Jake could see dozens of professors and officials rushing around with expressions of urgency on their faces. Everyone seemed to be talking at once, and Jake caught fragments of conversation in various languages that his translator struggled to render. Fundamental challenge to accepted wisdom, someone was saying. Potential paradigm shift of unprecedented magnitude, said another voice. Crisis management protocols may need to be activated, came from a third conversation. Professor Kelthera led them to a conference room where several important-looking aliens were already waiting. Jake recognized Dean Zorvath, a tall Altarian with silver skin who ran the philosophy department. There was also Chancellor Thurok, a massive Korath who controlled the entire science division. But the being who worried Jake the most was someone he didn't recognize. A creature that looked like it was made of living shadow with eyes that glowed like stars. The translator identified it as speaking for the Galactic Council. Mr. Morrison. Ms. Chen, Dean Zorvath said, his musical voice carrying harmonics of stress. We need you to explain exactly what humans mean when they say extinction is reversible. Jake sat down and tried to organize his thoughts. Well, it depends on how long the species has been extinct, and how much genetic material we have to work with. For recently extinct species, we can usually clone them using a closely related species as an egg donor. For older extinctions, we need to do more genetic reconstruction. And humans do this routinely. Chancellor Thurrock growled. Not routinely, Lisa said. It's expensive and technically challenging, but it's not considered impossible anymore. There are probably a dozen major de-extinction projects running right now, with more starting every year. The shadow being leaned forward, its star-like eyes growing brighter. When it spoke, its voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. Humans, Morrison and Chen, your species' attitude toward extinction threatens the philosophical foundation of galactic civilization. Every species learns wisdom through loss. Every species accepts the permanence of death. This shared experience is what allows different species to coexist peacefully. Jake felt confused and a little defensive. But why would you want things to stay extinct if you could bring them back? Wouldn't it be better to have more life instead of less life? The silence that followed his question was so complete that Jake could hear his own heartbeat. All the alien officials looked at each other with expressions he couldn't interpret. Finally, Dean Zorvath spoke in a voice so quiet it was barely above a whisper. Mr. Morrison, in all the galaxy's history, you are the first being to ask that question. 3 days after the meeting in the conference room, Jake found himself sitting in the most important building on New Geneva. The Galactic Council's emergency session chamber was so large that Jake couldn't see the back wall through the atmospheric haze. Representatives from hundreds of different species filled the circular seating arrangement that spiraled up toward the domed ceiling. Jake sat at a small table in the center of it all, wearing his best clothes, which still looked shabby compared to the elaborate robes and technological augmentations worn by the council members around him. Lisa sat next to him, looking just as nervous as he felt. Council Chairman Zerath, an ancient being whose species had achieved spaceflight when humans were still living in caves, called the session to order. His voice carried the weight of millennia as it echoed through the massive chamber. Fellow beings of the galaxy, he began, we gather today to address what may be the most significant challenge to our understanding of life and death in recorded history. The human students Morrison and Chen have revealed that their species practices resurrection of extinct life forms as a matter of routine science. A wave of sound swept through the chamber as hundreds of different species expressed their thoughts simultaneously. Jake heard clicking, buzzing, growling, singing, and sounds his human ears weren't designed to process. The implications of this revelation, Chairman Zerath continued, extend far beyond mere scientific curiosity. For 10,000 years, the shared experience of permanent loss has been the foundation of interspecies cooperation. Our art, our philosophy, our very understanding of progress and responsibility all rest upon the acceptance that some things once gone are gone forever. A representative from the warrior species Korath stood up, his massive frame casting shadows across the floor. Chairman Zerath, my people have built our entire culture around honoring the extinct deep swimmers who once shared our oceans. We consider them our spiritual ancestors, elevated beyond mortal existence through the permanence of their absence. He turned to look directly at Jake. Now this human suggests we could bring them back, as if they were merely sleeping rather than transcended. This undermines everything we believe about the nature of existence itself. Jake stood up, his legs shaking slightly. Sir, I don't understand why you wouldn't want to meet your ancestors. If the deep swimmers were intelligent, wouldn't they have wanted to live? Wouldn't they have wanted to see how your people developed after they were gone? The Korath representative's ears flattened against his head in a gesture of extreme distress. Human Morrison, you miss the point entirely. The beauty of their existence comes from its completion. The meaning of their lives comes from their ending. To bring them back would be to diminish what they achieved through death. Jake felt more confused than ever. But if they're alive, they could achieve new things. They could see what their world looks like now. They could learn about space travel and meet other species. Wouldn't that be better than being dead? A representative of the ethereals, her gaseous form contained within a shimmering force field, produced harmonics that made the air itself seem to sing with sadness. Young human, your people view existence only in terms of continuation. You do not understand the beauty of conclusion, the poetry of finality, the wisdom that comes from accepting limits. Actually, Lisa said, standing up next to Jake, humans write a lot of poetry about death too, but we also write poetry about resurrection and second chances and triumph over impossible odds. Some of our most famous stories are about people who came back from the dead. Chairman Zerath raised his hand for silence. Ms. Chen, are you saying that human culture celebrates resurrection? Well, yeah, Lisa said. I mean, one of our major religions is built around the idea of someone dying and coming back to life. And our mythology is full of heroes who journey to the land of the dead and return with wisdom or treasure, or loved ones they've rescued. The chamber erupted in chaos. Representatives from dozens of species began talking at once, their translators struggling to keep up with the volume of overlapping conversations. Jake caught fragments of what was being said, and none of it sounded good. Cultural deviancy of the highest order, someone was saying. Fundamental rejection of natural law, came another voice. Dangerous precedent for galactic stability, said a third. But Jake also heard other comments that surprised him. Revolutionary approach to existence, one representative was arguing. Potential for unprecedented advancement, said another. Challenges us to reconsider basic assumptions about life and death, came from somewhere else in the chamber. Chairman Zerath eventually restored order by activating some kind of sound dampening field that made it impossible for anyone except him to be heard. The council recognizes that we face an unprecedented situation, he announced. Never before has a species joining galactic civilization brought with them a fundamental rejection of extinction as permanent. The humans represent either an evolutionary leap in sapient thinking or a dangerous deviation that could destabilize the philosophical foundations of our society. A representative Jake didn't recognize stood up, her crystalline body refracting light into rainbow patterns. Chairman, since the humans revealed their resurrection capabilities, 17 different species have begun emergency research programs to attempt de-extinction of their own lost creatures. The Zephyrians are trying to recreate their crystal singers. The Altarians want to bring back their glass wings. Even the Ethereals are attempting to reconstruct the consciousness patterns of their extinct crystal entities. She gestured toward a section of the chamber where Jake could see representatives arguing intensely among themselves. 3 planetary governments have already fallen as their populations demand immediate resurrection programs. The philosophical chaos is spreading faster than we can contain it. Jake felt sick to his stomach. I never meant for any of this to happen. I just answered a question about extinct animals. We understand that, Mr. Morrison, Chairman Zerath said, his ancient voice carrying a note of something that might have been sympathy. But your innocent answer has revealed something about humanity that changes everything we thought we knew about the development of sapient life. A new voice spoke from the highest tier of the chamber, so high up that Jake had to squint to see the speaker. It was a being he didn't recognize, something that looked like it might be made of living metal. The question before us, the metallic being said, is whether humanity represents the next stage of sapient evolution, or a dangerous aberration that threatens the stability of galactic civilization. Jake looked around the chamber at hundreds of alien faces staring down at him. Some showed curiosity, others showed fear, and many showed expressions he couldn't read at all. Mr. Morrison, Chairman Zerath said, before we proceed with formal deliberations, the Council would like to hear directly from you. In your own words, explain to us how humanity views the relationship between life and death. Jake took a deep breath and tried to organize his thoughts. He looked at Lisa, who nodded encouragingly. Well, he began, humans don't really think death has to be permanent if we don't want it to be. The silence that followed Jake's statement was so complete that he wondered if the sound dampening field was still active. Hundreds of alien representatives stared down at him, their various sensory organs focused on the young human who had just challenged the fundamental beliefs of galactic civilization. Chairman Zerath finally broke the silence. Mr. Morrison, please elaborate on that statement. What do you mean when you say death doesn't have to be permanent? Jake looked around the massive chamber, feeling the weight of all those alien eyes upon him. I mean exactly what I said. Death is just another problem to solve. Maybe we can't solve it yet, but that doesn't mean we stop trying. He stood up straighter, gaining confidence as he spoke. When my great-great-grandmother died, she made my family promise to bring her back if we ever figured out how. We've got her DNA stored in a genetic bank, and my cousin Danny is working on the memory reconstruction problem. My aunt died of cancer last year, but we've already cured that same type of cancer in laboratory mice. If we'd had another few years to perfect the treatment, she'd still be alive. A Vorthan representative's crystalline skin shifted through a spectrum of colors that Jake had learned indicated severe emotional distress. Human Morrison, you speak of death as if it were merely a technical challenge to overcome, isn't it? Jake asked genuinely. I mean, people die because their hearts stop, or their brains get damaged, or they get sick with something we don't know how to cure yet. But hearts can be restarted, brains can potentially be repaired, and we're learning to cure new diseases all the time. Lisa stood up beside him. On Earth, we've already extended human lifespan significantly through medicine and technology. People who would have died from infections a century ago now live full lives because we developed antibiotics. People who would have died from heart problems now get artificial hearts or heart transplants. The logical next step, Jake continued, is to figure out how to prevent aging, cure genetic diseases, and eventually reverse death itself if it happens before we want it to. An elderly Altarian representative stood up slowly, his silver skin dim with age. Young humans, your species speaks of conquering death as if it were an enemy to be defeated. But death gives life meaning. Without endings, there can be no stories. Without loss, there can be no appreciation for what remains. Jake shook his head. But sir, we're not trying to get rid of stories or make people stop appreciating life. We just want people to live as long as they want to live and die when they choose to die. Not when random chance or disease forces them to die. And what about extinction? Asked the Korath representative who had spoken earlier. What about species that have completed their time in the universe? Why should any species have to complete their time? Jake asked back. If the deep swimmers were intelligent and they wanted to live, why shouldn't they get to see what the universe is like now? Why shouldn't they get to meet other species and explore the stars? The massive chamber erupted again, but this time Jake could hear that the chaos was different. Some representatives were arguing angrily, but others sounded excited or curious. The translations were coming too fast for him to follow, but he caught fragments that suggested the galaxy was dividing into two camps. Dangerous rejection of natural order, he heard from one section. Revolutionary potential for advancement, came from another area. Fundamental threat to established philosophy, someone was saying. While another voice argued, unprecedented opportunity for growth and discovery. Chairman Zerath activated the sound-dampening field again. The Council recognizes that we are witnessing a historic moment. For the first time in recorded galactic history, a species has joined our civilization with a completely different understanding of life, death, and extinction. He looked directly at Jake and Lisa. Humans Morrison and Chen, your casual attitude toward resurrection challenges every philosophical and spiritual tradition in the galaxy. Some see this as evolution, others as devolution. Some see opportunity, others see catastrophe. A new figure stood up in the highest tier of the chamber, someone Jake hadn't noticed before. It was another human, a middle-aged woman in a formal diplomatic uniform. Chairman Zerath, if I may, the woman said. I am Ambassador Patricia Wells, representing Earth in these proceedings. I think it's important for the Council to understand that humanity is not trying to impose our views on resurrection and de-extinction on other species. She gestured toward Jake and Lisa. These students have simply shared honest information about human scientific capabilities and cultural attitudes. Earth is prepared to work with any species that wishes to explore de-extinction technologies. But we also respect the right of species to maintain their traditional approaches to death and extinction. A representative from a species Jake didn't recognize, something that looked like a walking tree with eyes, spoke up. But the knowledge exists now. The possibility exists. How can we ignore it? My people lost the singing forest during our industrial period. For 2,000 years we have mourned them in our art and literature, but if they could be brought back. That's exactly the problem, interrupted an ethereal representative, her gaseous form pulsing with agitated energy. The humans have introduced a possibility that makes traditional acceptance of loss seem like giving up. How do we continue to find meaning in endings when endings might not be necessary? Jake looked around the chamber, finally beginning to understand the scope of what his simple answer had caused. I'm really sorry, he said. I never meant to upset everyone's beliefs. I was just trying to answer Professor Kelthera's question. Chairman Zerath's ancient features softened slightly. Mr. Morrison, you have done nothing wrong. You have simply revealed a fundamental difference between human thinking and the rest of galactic civilization. The question now is what we do with that knowledge. The debate that followed lasted for hours. Jake and Lisa were eventually allowed to sit down, while representatives from hundreds of species argued about the implications of human resurrection technology. Some demanded that Earth be quarantined until the galaxy could adapt to this new paradigm. Others insisted that resurrection research should begin immediately on their homeworlds. Finally, as the artificial sun of New Geneva began to set outside the great windows of the chamber, Chairman Zareth called for a preliminary vote. "The question before us," he announced, "is whether humanity should be granted full membership in galactic civilization, despite their revolutionary approach to extinction and death, or whether they represent too great a disruption to our established order." The vote was closer than any major decision in Galactic Council history. By a margin of only 12 votes out of over 800 cast, humanity was granted full membership, but with unprecedented conditions. Earth must share all de-extinction and resurrection technologies with any species that requests them, Chairman Zareth announced. Humanity must also establish a galaxy-wide resurrection ethics council to prevent the chaos of uncontrolled species restoration. As the session ended and representatives began filing out of the chamber, Jake overheard conversations in dozens of languages. The translations were fragmentary, but the message was clear. The galaxy would never be the same. 5 years later, Jake Morrison stood in his office as director of the Galactic Resurrection Institute, watching through his window as the first cloned crystal singer in 3,000 years took flight over the campus of New Geneva University. The creature's wings caught the light like living stained glass as it soared between the university spires, its song echoing across the campus. On his desk sat a photo from his graduation ceremony, showing him standing next to Professor Kelthara, whose crystalline skin had permanently shifted to a golden color that indicated wonder and amazement. The inscription on the photo read, "To Jake Morrison, who taught the galaxy that extinction is just another word for not yet." Outside his window, representatives from 17 different species worked in the Institute's laboratories, racing to bring back their own lost creatures. The galaxy was messier now, full of philosophical debates and diplomatic crises as civilizations struggled to adapt to the idea that death and extinction might be optional, but it was also more hopeful than it had ever been before. As Jake watched the crystal singer disappear into the purple sky of New Geneva, he smiled and thought about his great-great-grandmother's DNA samples, stored safely in the Institute's genetic vault. Someday soon, he would keep the promise his family had made to her. After all, humans had taught the galaxy that nothing had to be permanent if you refused to let it be. The morning sun of New Geneva cast long shadows across the university campus as students from dozens of different worlds hurried to their classes. The Galactic Institute of Xenobiology stood tall among the other buildings, its crystal spires reaching toward the purple sky. Inside the main lecture hall, Professor Kelthara arranged her notes with 2 of her 4 arms while the other 2 adjusted the holographic display system. Jake Morrison walked into the lecture hall carrying his worn backpack and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He was one of only 3 humans in the advanced xenobiology program. And at 22 years old, he often felt like the youngest person in any room full of aliens who lived for centuries. His brown hair was messy from running to class, and his simple university sweater had a small stain on the front that he hoped nobody would notice. The lecture hall buzzed with sounds that no Earth-born human ear was designed to process. Insectoid students from the hive worlds clicked and chittered to each other in rapid bursts of noise. The gaseous ethereals hummed in harmonics that made the air shimmer around their containment fields. Lupari students barked short phrases in their pack language while their tails wagged with excitement about the upcoming lesson. Jake found his usual seat in the back row, next to Lisa Chen, another human student who was working on her thesis about genetic preservation techniques. She nodded at him as he sat down, then went back to reading something on her datapad about DNA storage methods. Professor Kelthara stood at the front of the hall, her crystalline blue skin catching the light from the display screens. She was a Vorthon, a species known throughout the galaxy for their scientific minds and their ability to see patterns that other races missed. Her 4 arms moved independently as she pulled up charts and images on the holographic display. "Good morning, class," she said, her voice carrying easily through the large hall. "Today we will discuss one of the most universal experiences shared by all sapient species in the galaxy: We will talk about extinction patterns and how they shape the development of advanced civilizations. The hall grew quieter as students focused on the professor. Even the ethereals stopped their constant humming, which Jake had learned meant they were paying very close attention to something important. Every species that reaches the stars must first pass through what we call the Great Filter, Professor Kelthara continued. This is the period when a race develops technology fast enough to change their world, but not yet wise enough to prevent damage to their home planet's ecosystem. She gestured to the holographic display, which showed a series of beautiful creatures from different worlds. There was a flying creature with wings like stained glass from the Altarian homeworld, a massive swimming beast with tentacles that glowed in shifting colors from the deep oceans of Korath Prime, tiny crystalline beings that looked like living jewelry from the mountain ranges of Zephyr. These are examples of species that were lost during the technological development of various races, the professor explained. The Altarians lost their glass wings when they began building their first cities. The Korath saw their deep swimmers vanish when industrial chemicals polluted their oceans. The Zephyrians watched their crystal singers fade away when mining operations disturbed their mountain homes. Jake looked around the hall and saw that many of the alien students had expressions of sadness or respect on their faces. A Korath student in the front row had his ears pressed flat against his head in the way his species showed grief. This pattern repeats across every known sapient species, Professor Kelthara said. The transition from a primitive society to an advanced one always costs us some of our world's children. We learn from these losses. They teach us responsibility, restraint, and the value of protecting what remains. She paused and looked around the hall. These losses shape our art, our philosophy, and our approach to progress. The ethereal's greatest poetry speaks of the beauty found in endings. The Korath build monuments to honor their lost species. Every race carries the weight of what they have destroyed on their path to the stars. Jake shifted in his seat, thinking about the animals back on Earth. He remembered learning about passenger pigeons in school, and how the last one had died in a zoo over a century ago. But he also remembered reading about scientists who were working to bring them back using old DNA samples. The important thing to understand, Professor Kelthara continued, is that extinction is permanent. Once a species crosses that final threshold, it can never return. This permanence is what gives meaning to our responsibility as guardians of life. She clicked to the next image, showing empty habitats where lost species once lived. We can restore environments, but we cannot restore the creatures that once filled them. We can learn from our mistakes, but we cannot undo them. This is the universal truth that all sapient life must accept. The professor looked around the room again. Now I would like to hear from some of you. Can anyone share an example from their homeworld of a species that was lost during your people's development? What did your people learn from that loss? A Zephyrian student raised one of her 6 arms. When the professor nodded at her, she spoke in her musical language, which the universal translator rendered into standard galactic speech. My people lost the harmony makers, small creatures whose songs could make the mountain crystals resonate in perfect pitch. When we began our first mining operations 3,000 years ago, the vibrations from our machines disrupted their nesting grounds. Within 50 years, they were all gone. And what did the Zephyrians learn from this loss? Professor Kelthara asked. We learned to listen before we dig, the student replied. All of our mining operations now include harmony specialists who make sure we don't disturb any remaining crystal ecosystems. The professor nodded approvingly and called on another student. A massive Korath raised his clawed hand. The deep swimmers were the first intelligent species my people encountered, he growled through his translator. They could communicate through sonar patterns that painted pictures in the water. But our early factories dumped waste into the deep ocean trenches where they lived. By the time we realized they were trying to talk to us, the last pod had died from poisoned water. And the lesson learned? The professor prompted. That intelligence comes in forms we might not recognize, the Korath said. Now we test all ecosystems for signs of complex communication before we change them. Professor Kelthara smiled, showing her crystalline teeth. Excellent examples. These stories show how loss teaches us wisdom. She looked around the hall once more. Now here is a question I want you to think carefully about. In all the history of galactic civilization, has anyone ever heard of a species that returned from extinction? Can anyone provide an example of life that came back after it had completely vanished? The hall fell completely silent. Students looked at each other with expressions that clearly said such a thing was impossible. The very idea seemed to confuse them. Professor Kelthara waited for several long moments, then began to nod as if this silence proved her point. As you can see, extinction is truly permanent. Once the last member of a species dies, that evolutionary path is closed forever. This is why the responsibility of stewardship is so. From the back of the hall, a hand slowly rose into the air, every eye, sensor, and sensory organ in the room turned toward Jake Morrison, who sat there with his hand up, looking slightly uncomfortable with all the attention. Professor Kelthara blinked all four of her eyes in surprise. "Yes, Mr. Morrison?" she said. "Do you have a question about the permanence of extinction?" Jake cleared his throat and shifted in his seat. "Actually, Professor, I think I might have an example of species coming back from extinction. Humans have brought back quite a few species that were completely gone." The lecture hall erupted in a cacophony of sounds as every species began expressing disbelief in their own way.